Are you a woman whose life is dedicated to Christian ministry? Do you have a burden to bind up the brokenhearted, set captives free, and lead women to crowns of beauty instead of ashes? Welcome to the Everyday Royalty Podcast, where we dig deeper into strategies that turn the broken into beautiful and make trials your training ground so you can go out as a daughter of the King to lead others into peace and healing. Here's your host, licensed professional clinical counselor and faith and focus coach, Carrie Kitchen.
Today's guest is Pastor Chris Sasser. Pastor Chris has been serving kids, students, and families in full-time church ministry for almost 30 years. He is the pastor of family ministries at Port City Community Church in Wilmington, North Carolina, overseeing the ministries for kids from birth through high school and their parents. He is also a lead consultant for Ministry Architects, where he helps churches around the country build healthy systems. In today's conversation, we're talking about Pastor Chris's book, Bags, Helping Your Kids Lighten the Load. Not only is this message incredibly powerful for the youth in your life, it can also be very beneficial in helping you acknowledge and label what bags maybe you have been carrying that need to be let go. I trust that you will love this episode and encourage you to share it with a friend who would love to hear it too. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to the show, Chris. I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Hey, Carrie, thanks for having me. I'm excited to have a fun conversation.
Absolutely. So I want to start by just inviting you to share some of your story. So your testimony that leads up to what God has you doing now and about this book that you've written that you're going to share about with us today.
Yeah. So my name's Chris Sasser. I live in Wilmington, North Carolina, which is a little beach town off the coast. I've lived in North Carolina all of my life, grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina. And from a testimony standpoint, I mean, I was a little bit of a church kid growing up, kind of, sort of. I'm the youngest of three. And so I think by the time, and I'm significantly younger than my brother, who's the middle child. And I think by the time that sort of they got to me, my parents were a little tired of church. And so I didn't really go a whole lot kind of in my middle school and high school years, which is ironic because I've led middle school and high school ministry all of my adult life. But I wasn't really a part of it when I was kind of in that phase of my life. But when I got to high school, I was surrounded by a group of friends who really understood the gospel, who really understood what it meant to follow Jesus. They were a part of FCA, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I was an athlete, so I was around a lot of those guys. There was a big group of folks who went to Young Life. Young Life was kind of becoming a big deal at my high school. So it was crazy. It was really on spring break of my senior year at Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, is when I would say I became a believer, which is not everybody's spring break senior year story. I get that. But I just had some people who were around me who were really kind of encouraging me. And so for me, college was a tremendous amount of time of growth to where, again, I was really around some people who discipled me well and who helped me grow in my faith. And so started really growing then. And towards the end of my college career, was invited to work full-time at a YMCA, and which was kind of in a town not too far. So I started working at YMCA doing really it was ministry, but we were running, after school programs, summer camp programs, did that for a couple of years. And then when I graduated, the Y wanted me to come work full time. And I did that for a year and it was great. But what I found was the people who I gravitated towards the most were my high school and college students who were my staff. I didn't really love being around the little kids. And after a year of being at the Y, having all these middle school or all these high school and college students who worked for me, they were all kind of going to a church that was a growing church, and the church needed a youth pastor. And so they hired me after a series of interviews as a one-year intern to kind of be the youth pastor at this church. And 19 years later, I was still there and had kind of morphed into the, gone from youth pastor into a family ministry pastor. I'd played that role for a number of years. And so that was up until about 2000. And then in 2000, my wife and I kind of got a call to a church in Wilmington to come be the, not 2000, 2012. So we were in Raleigh from 2000 to 2012. So around 2012 or 13, we got a call to come here and be a part of a church in Wilmington, North Carolina, Port City Community Church. And so I started there as sort of the student ministry pastor. And after a few years, morphed into the family ministry pastor. So for me, it was really being around church a little bit as a kid, kind of understanding a little bit, really understanding the gospel and deciding to follow Jesus in late high school and through college, and then pretty quickly jumping into ministry. And so now I serve as the pastor of family ministries at Port City Community Church, married to my wife, Karen. We've been married for 20 years. She was actually the middle school pastor at my church in Raleigh for a long time. And I like to say I had to put together a search committee to find my wife. And so we worked together for a couple of years, and then we both knew that we were destined for each other. So we have two kids. We have a son who just graduated high school. He's headed off to college here in a couple of weeks. We have a daughter who's going to be a junior in high school. And really for I would say all four of us, as a family, we want to love and honor Jesus, and we want to help encourage people along the way. And so, family ministry pastor, I do some consulting with an organization called Ministry Architects, which is super fun. We kind of help churches build healthy, sustainable systems along the way. I do some content creation for an organization called Ministry to Parents, because one of my heart is to really help parents. Kind of in my later years here in ministry, I'm still a youth pastor at heart. But what I'm going to do is just do youth ministry in a different way and family ministry in a different way, and try to really help equip and encourage parents. So I did do some of that, and obviously over the last couple of years, this project for the book has come to life, which has really been interesting to me, because I never aspired to write a book at all. It was honestly, and I don't typically over spiritualize things, but it was an idea God gave me, and I talked to a lot of friends and people, and they were like, please write this. And so I did. So anyway, that's kind of my story. Love kind of being in ministry and being able to equip and encourage people as best I can.
That's beautiful. Love it. So,
Thanks.
with this book that you've written, I know that comes out of a lot of time spent observing the different struggles that the children you're working with, the youth you're working with, the families you're working with, a lot of the struggles that you've watched them go through, and they're coming to you with. Because I mean, I've been a youth pastor before too, a former youth pastor, and I know that you see these kids struggling with things, and that's kind of played into this book quite heavily, hasn't it?
Oh, for sure. So I'll tell the story of kind of where the book came from, and this
Absolutely.
is it's in the book, but I can tell it quicker than I wrote it. So basically, during the time that that I was kind of youth pastor, my wife was doing kind of middle school ministry. We had a lot of kids in the church who would graduate and they go off to college, and it was time to get married. And so of course, we were super clse to them, so they would come back to me and say, "Hey, can you be the official at our wedding?" And of course, we'd say yes, because we'd love to be in those moments with families. And so oftentimes we knew one of them. They had met their future spouse at college, so we didn't kind of really know them, or sometimes we knew them both. But basically, we had this premarital process that we would go through, and we'd have them over to our house for night one, and we would say, "Hey, act like you don't know us." I mean, we'd have dinner and just exchange the pleasantries, but then we'd get to really talking, and we'd say, "Hey, act like you don't know us, and give us your life story, your faith story, and your family story." And Carrie, what they would do is they would just unload on us with their story. A lot of stuff we knew, a lot of stuff we didn't know. And they would leave, and I would look at Karin, my wife, and I would say, "Honey, oh my gosh, they are carrying so much emotional baggage that it was just kind of painful." And of course, the next number of sessions are unpacking as much as we can with them. But they're headed into what is hopefully one of the most exciting times of their life, and they've got all this emotional baggage, and they don't know what to do with it. And so our kids were young, kind of at that time, and I started doing what a lot of parents do is I started saying, okay, like, what are our kids going to be saying when they're in premarital counseling, in somebody else's kitchen 20 years from now? And I'm a diehard optimist. I mean, I've got a good friend who's called me stupidly optimistic before, but I just started thinking, like, do our kids have to have all of this emotional baggage when they get to their young adult years? I mean, I'm not naive enough to think that all of us aren't going to have some baggage at some level, but would there be a way as a parent that I could just sort of pay more attention to the bags, if you will? And that's the title of the book. It's called Bags, Helping Your Kids Lighten the Load. If I could just pay more attention to the bags that our kids are packing kind of along the way, would there be some ways that I could just help my kids be more healthy when they get to their young adult years? Because for me, what I've done as a parent, especially in the last couple of years, thinking through all this and reflecting back on years of ministry, is I've kind of changed the target for what success looks like in parenting for me. And most people, at least in Western American culture, our success kind of metric is our kids get the best grades and are on the right sports team, and they get to the right college, and they marry the right person, and they get the good job and make the money and perpetuate the cycle. And we both would know a lot of people who that's kind of been their path in life, and they're miserable. So for me, the changing of the bullseye has been, I just want my kids to be healthy. Like, I want them to get to their young adult years, and I want them to be mentally, emotionally, relationally, and spiritually healthy. And if I can get them to those years and they'll be relatively healthy, I don't care where they work. I don't care how much money they make. I mean, all of that's going to sort of, it's going to fall into place. And so basically, I started doing focus groups with young adults and college students, kind of as I had this idea of I just want to help kids be healthier, and I just started kind of floating that idea out. Hey, I know you got some bags from when you were growing up. Tell me what they are. And I did that for about a year and a half, honestly. And I talked to 400 college students, young adults. And then at that point, I'd been in ministry for 25 plus years. So reflecting on kind of all the ministry experience that I'd had with families and kids and teenagers, listening to the focus groups, I developed these 8 common bags that I think kids pack. And the book really is what are the bags, what are some things that are kind of what I call the burden of the bag, like what happens to you if you as a person pack this bag. But what I'm hoping is super helpful, not just for parents, but for anybody that works with the next generation, is just some practical suggestions on how do you help these kids lighten the load. Like what are some things that you can do along the way? And I say kind of, from the age of 5 to 25, how can you basically build a preventive maintenance plan for helping your kids be healthier when they get to their young adult years? Because what I believe is these kids are carrying and packing some emotional baggage that they have no idea how to deal with. And it's so deep and it's so painful and it's so hurtful. And as parents specifically, we are in a unique position to be able to help our kids lighten the load if we pay attention. And so that's kind of what I want to do, is raise the flag for all of us who work with kids to say, hey, the baggage is real and we got to help them along the way. So that's kind of where the book came from, in a nutshell. That's probably a longer story than I wrote, to be honest with you, but oh well.
It was perfect. And as like not only being in ministry in my story, but also being a therapist, because that's another part of my story. I'm looking at the list of bags, and that is so spot on, because these are all things that I see adults struggle with, and that comes so much from childhood. So I love the concept that it's like emotional and spiritual clutter that gets piled into our bags. It gets heavier and heavier and heavier. But if we can train our children to not pack those things into the bag, to get it before it goes in, then they don't have so much to unpack when they're older. And I love that concept. I think it's brilliant.
Well, one of the interesting things that happened is when this idea first came to mind, I thought, well, surely somebody else has kind of talked about this. And so I started looking for, hey, I don't need to write this book. It's already there. And it was interesting. I just couldn't find anything because, there's lots of stuff about unpacking your bags once you've packed them. And, we go to counseling and we go talk to people like you because we need to unpack our bags. But there really just wasn't anything that I could find that was kind of on the front end, the preventive maintenance plan. And the other thing that's super interesting to me is every time I have a chance to talk to either parents or, leaders about this in a seminar, I'm always talking about, hey, here's how you can help your kids lighten the load. But everybody goes, oh no, I have those bags. Like I have that stuff going on. And if you're a parent, it's hard not to kind of pass some of the same stuff on. And so we all have it. If we're older and we have the bags, we need to go see people like you. We need to kind of get into counseling. We need to talk to our pastor. We need to have a trusted friend who can help us unpack it. I was actually in a seminar yesterday with a group of educators that I was talking to about this. And one guy at the end of it said, well, I mean, I knew that baggage was a real thing, but after kind of digging into it today, I just realized how big it is. And I think that's true for all of us. So many of us are really good at stuffing our bags down there. And at some point, with some people they come out when you're 30, 40, or 50, and that's never pretty. And so for me, again, it's just an awareness thing, not just for what's going on with our kids, but also for us as adults to kind of get in touch with what our baggage is so that we can deal with it in a healthy way and it doesn't come out and hurt other people in the process.
And also when we as adults learn to handle the baggage and empty the bags and unpack all that and get it cleaned out, then we are better able to not only recognize it forming with our children, but also to be able to help them to work through it because we've been there then. We know how to overcome those things. I'm even thinking that spiritually speaking, how scripture talks about the generational sin patterns we have and the consequences of those sins. So you're talking about passing down these emotional bags, and that's generational sin patterns. Yes. So if we can stop those patterns and learn to train our thinking to be more in alignment with Christ, then of course that's going to be healthier for us because we're not going to be packing these emotional bags. Can you share with us what these bags are? Just kind of over the list of what the bags are, because I know people are going to hear themselves in the list.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, I hear myself in almost all of them, quite honestly. So 8 common bags. And like I said, I know there are more bags that we pack along the way, but these are just the ones that I heard most often
Hmm.
from college students and young adults. And then in reflecting on years of ministry, I just it validated what I was hearing from them. So the 8 are relational bags. And the relational bags come in a couple of different layers, and a few of the bags have different layers. But the relational bags, we start with relational bags with our parents. I mean, we all have relational bags with our parents, even if it's a good relationship, and even if we love them. Oftentimes the parenting relationship can become really mechanical, especially kind of as kids are growing up. And what I mean by that is, everybody's got to get up and have breakfast and put their shoes on and get off to school and come back home and do their homework and go to the ball game or practice or whatever. And it's just kind of this cycle, and the relationship gets crowded out, especially in today's time where we're all overscheduled in a lot of different ways. So there's relational baggage with parents that kind of gets built. There's if there's more than one child in the home, there's relational baggage with siblings. That always happens. And so sibling rivalry is a real thing. And so you got to pay attention to what's going on kind of with your kids and their relational bags with each other. There's relational bags with peers, all the time. Kids are packing those relational bags because kids can be mean to each other, and they can pack these bags that'll kind of last for a lifetime. And so there's a couple layers there. There's the performance bag, which I think is one of the kind of the biggest ones nowadays, just because the pressure to perform that a lot of these kids and teenagers are under is just unbelievable. And so there's pressure to perform in school. There's pressure to perform in sports. There's pressure to perform kind of just socially. and quite honestly, the smartphone and social media is a game changer in that, because now the pressure to perform that I used to feel, or and maybe even you too, that we used to feel, when we'd go to school or we'd be a part of an activity, when we came home, there might have been a little bit of a respite there. There might have been a pressure to perform in your family, because that exists as well. But you were able to rest. Well, now, with kids on social media and having to get likes and having to filter things, it's just the pressure to perform is nonstop for these kids. And actually, if you don't mind, I want to read a quote from a teenager that I actually got this about 6 months ago. It was after the book had been written and was getting ready to come out. But we were doing a survey at our church with teenagers about, hey, what are some things that you need help with and we need to talk about at our church? And first of all, what they said was mental health, mental health, mental health, mental health, mental health. We heard that over and over again. But listen to this one quote that I think really plays into the performance bag. This one high school student said this. It was anonymous. Stress levels are enormous. I used to love school, but now I stare at the clock until the bell rings. I play sports, which means I have to miss some class, but I have to make it up later. My parents aren't any help either. They're part of the problem. You better watch that 93 in science. It's getting to be a little bit close to an A-. They don't get it. Keeping perfect grades while playing 3 sports a year is difficult, but don't let them see me too sad or too stressed or too much of any negative emotion. They'll blame it on my cell phone and they'll snatch it right up until I cry at the dinner table about it. Here's the real kind of kicker phrase. Somebody has to tell adults that we will crumble without some sort of relief. That's baggage.
Oh, goodness,
in a big way, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of baggage going on there in that situation. So performance baggage, there's identity baggage, where kids today are kind of asking, who am I and where do I belong? Like who have I been created to be, and who are my people? Where are my people? They kind of want to know that. There's comparison baggage that happens all the time, where they're comparing themselves to each other and their siblings and their parents and the world. And again, technology and social media does not help with that. There's just layers of comparison baggage that come their way all the time. There's authority baggage that they pack, kind of wondering, like, who's in charge of me? Like, am I in charge of me? Are my parents in charge of me? Is God in charge of me? Can authority even be trusted? I mean, we live in a culture where we're nonstop questioning authority nowadays, and I could talk about that for a long time. But kids are listening to us as adults question authority, so therefore they wonder if authority is valid. And that's some real baggage that they're going to have to deal with in a lot of ways. Rejection baggage, where they just get rejected from either people or organizations, and they don't know how to deal with that. Guilt and shame baggage, guilt around decisions that they've made, shame around, who they feel like they now are because of those. Sometimes the guilt and shame baggage comes because of something that's happened to them that they had no control over. They were a victim, but there's still guilt and shame baggage there that is real. And then the last one is disappointment baggage. And, it's just kids learning how to deal with disappointment. And quite honestly, we have a little bit of a generation where parents have shielded kids from having to deal with disappointment. And so they don't really know how to. It's I don't know if you've heard the term the lawnmower parent. There's helicopter parent that hovers, the lawnmower parent, or in some parts of the country, they call it a snowplow parent. It's the parent that just gets out in front and plows everything or mows everything down so that their kid has a clear path to walk on, nice green grass. And so therefore they don't know how to deal with disappointment because they haven't dealt with it. So they get to their college and young adult years and hit something that's disappointing and they just crumble because they don't know how to deal with it. So there's disappointment baggage. So those are the 8 bags. Again, I know there's more baggage that we pack, but that's just what I heard most often.
That's a very powerful message just in itself. Just being able to identify those goes a long way, and being able to learn ways to cope with them, and just to acknowledgement's the first step. Just
Oh
saying,
yeah.
hey, this is something I'm dealing with. Whoa, let's look at this a little bit because I recognize that this isn't healthy. And I recognize that this isn't healthy for my kids to be dealing with. But I think as parents, especially, and dealing with parents in ministry, regardless of what side of the puzzle you're on, I guess. But just being able to see that unfolding and being able to say, okay, I see you struggling. I think just for not just kids, but adults too, just to know that they're seen. You read that quote from the teen. That's just such an incredible quote because that child needs to be seen. That
Yeah.
child needs to be understood and to know that they're understood and to know that their struggle matters and not to have that just dismissed. Just to know that there is a way to cope with it and to help to just guidance over how to deal with that. Just like you're saying with the lawnmower parents.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that term before, but that is so spot on. Just
Yeah.
to know that like sometimes that happens. So then when you get to the real world, quote unquote,
Yep.
it's not like that. That's not
Yeah.
realistic.
And one of the ways I've heard it described recently is that parents have become their kids' agent.
That's a
They're
good way
their
of saying
kids'
it.
agent for, they're just going to make sure they negotiate everything for their
Yeah.
kids. And then when their kids get to a point where they have to do it on their own, and they just are lost. Another thing I want to say just about sort of the awareness around the baggage is, and somebody asked me this yesterday, like had I been in any circles where I was talking with teenagers about this? And the broad answer is no. I haven't done that really yet, other than kind of the initial focus groups to hear baggage. But as far as kind of figuring out how to deal with it, but my 2 kids. So I have like I said, an 18-year-old son, 16-year-old daughter, and I started this project maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and really was in it 3 or 4 years ago. But because they knew that I was doing this, I was having frequent conversations at home with my would have been then 15 and 13-year-old about emotional baggage. Now, my hope and my prayer is that's going to be incredibly valuable for them when they get older, that they just understand sort of the narrative of this conversation that you can have, and kind of the identification of their bags. Because I promise you, I never had any conversation like that when I was growing up. And there have even been moments as I've had a conversation, one specific one with my son, where something was going on. I was asking him to pray for something for me. We were at an event, and it was pray for your son, pray for your dad. And I said something kind of about the book and the project and something that was going on with our daughter, so 2 years younger than him. And he said to me, he said, Dad, you need to be careful with the way that you're dealing with that with Kylie, because you're trying to not pack this bag, but you might be packing another one.
Wow, that's
insight. So the 14-year-old got it.
Yeah.
Right. And was able to have that conversation. And so I do think kind of creating a conversation around the emotional bags that we pack is incredibly valuable for not only adults to talk about, when it comes to their kids, but for kids to talk about. So that's kind of going to hopefully be the next iteration for me, is how do you put, kids and teenagers in a room to talk about this?
Absolutely.
Along with their parents, to be able to figure out how to do this well.
To teach them to communicate with their parents,
Correct.
the parents to communicate with their kids. So
That's right.
Everybody's heard, everybody's understood, and they can unpack it and lighten the load together.
That's right.
So what advice do you give on lightening that load for parents to help their children do it, for ministry leaders to teach parents? What advice do you give?
Well, it depends on the bag. I mean, in the book, every single bag has different advice on specific things you can do to lighten the load. I'll kind of jump into the performance bag and maybe give kind of a specific there that I know is a big one, and one that I have to kind of think through myself. But it's because these kids are feeling so much pressure to perform. What if, as parents, we reduced the pressure at home? That's just like a practical thing you can do, because, and it's a little bit kind of against what most parents would think. I mean, most parents think, like we have to put pressure on about, making sure that you got your homework done and making sure you've got your room cleaned and making sure that you've done this and you've done that. And again, it's just this nonstop sort of drone with these kids of more pressure. What if, as parents, we just sort of reduced the pressure at home and gave them that place to be able to sort of, kind of rest a little bit and relax? Could they maybe just be a little bit more healthy? And so that's kind of one. I think, maybe like with the rejection bag, I'll give an example. Like there are going to be times when kids are rejected by either an organization. Maybe they didn't get into the honor society or didn't make the team or whatever. And as parents, we have to pay attention to when rejection moments happen. Let's say they're being rejected by a group of friends, and you got to be kind of close enough to your kid to know that that's going on. But when your kids get rejected by anything, you need to be more present for a season. Like you just need to lean in and be more present relationally with them. And then the thing I'll say too, that is all throughout the book, and it's just sort of peppered through all the different recommendations, is the key here is just having a real relationship with your kids, and not one that where you're just kind of their guardian in sort of the traditional sense and got to get them through high school and get them out. No, you got to have like a really deep, authentic relationship with them where they trust you and you trust them. And it grows and changes depending on their age, and there's different appropriate conversations to have, but you got to have a real relationship with them. And that connection is so important. One of the ways that I've had a conversation in my church recently coming out of the pandemic, because it's a little bit of a tangent, but it matters. In the pandemic, a lot of churches, they had to create a lot of content, because people were home watching. So you got to watch the video and you got to connect on, Zoom online or whatever. We're going to send you this thing to read. It's all great content. But what I heard, we did a focus group with some adults from our church coming kind of in the middle of the pandemic. What I heard them say is they wanted connection. So I kind of came up with this phrase: connection over content. Connection over content. Content still matters at times, but it's connection over content. The same is true with our kids. What our kids want is connection over content. We're really good as parents at giving content, teaching them how to do things, instructing them on things, but what they want is connection. And so kind of that's part of the relational conversation that I would say is a suggestion. But every one of the bags have, 6 or 7 different practical suggestions of how you might be able to lighten the load. And the reality is not every kid is packing every bag. And so, you have to kind of pick and choose and pay attention to what's going on with your kid to figure out what works well for you.
I love that at the end of every section of your book, you have the reflection questions just to help those who are reading it kind of see how those apply. Like what does this apply? What do you need to think about in this to see how to move forward if that's an issue, if that bag is being packed right now.
Yeah.
It's all very, very helpful.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'll tell you one other thing that I'm in the process of creating. I'm not done yet with all of the different bags, but what I want is to be able to facilitate the conversations kind of that we were talking about earlier, where parents can talk to kids. And so I'm trying to create these things I'm calling talk sheets, to where it's an opportunity for a family to sit down and have a conversation around a particular bag. So really a parent can do some investigation, if you will. Hey, like, are you packing this bag? Or how do you feel about our family relationships? Do you feel like there's too much pressure to perform in your life? It's just almost a little bit of a self-evaluation tool, but it's a way to introduce the conversation in your family and with kids. And so far I've created, I think, 3 of them. And I'm just giving those away. I have a website called equipandencourage.com, or you can go to thebagsbook.com. Those are 2 places where I'm going to be posting these things. And the plan is to build, one of those talk sheets for all of the bags, so that parents can, just download something, print it, and then have a conversation with their kids. But these conversations are critical.
They are, absolutely.
Yeah.
I completely agree. Like we said earlier, not just for the kids, but also for the parents who are having the conversations, because we all need to work through things. I mean, even as a therapist, I'm saying we all need to work through things. We don't want to pass those things along. So having those valuable conversations are going to have some aha moments for us as well. And that's going to be very, very valuable.
Totally agree. Yeah.
One question I was wondering about, you said you gave the example with the performance of being careful and letting your children rest. Is there like an extreme the other direction? Is there, like, how would you recommend someone not let their child go in the other direction? Or where would that line be? Because that sounds like a kind of a delicate balance sometimes.
Well, I would say letting your kid just sit on their computer and play Fortnite 6 hours a day is not rest. And right. So you just kind of have to monitor sort of what that looks like for your own child, kind of what their personality is. I mean, obviously you want them to be active. You want them to be doing things. You just have to pay attention to I mean, they just come to points of exhaustion, both mentally and physically, much quicker than a lot of adults are, but just because we've learned how to sort of be able to kind of get through the world. And so it totally depends on the kid. But I would say, and I was kind of joking about not letting them play, Fortnite for 6 hours a day, but you have to monitor their device usage, because what I think we've done as a culture is we've kind of settled on, I can veg by just grabbing my device and scrolling. And I just wouldn't let my kids do that too much, especially if they're younger, because it's a level of rest. It's a little bit of a opportunity to retreat, but it's also that their mind is still moving pretty fast because of what they're scrolling through. And so just you have to be able to give them the appropriate amount of time on the things that maybe do sort of give them a little bit of rest in life. Give them an appropriate amount of time to be active and to be out with friends. And I think that rest is more mental in kind of the way I'm talking about it than it is necessarily physical. And I don't know that I'm giving you a good answer, but it depends on the kid. Yeah, you don't want them to be lazy. You don't want them to be lazy, but you also don't want them to be so overly scheduled and so overly busy that they just don't ever have a time to let their mind rest, because that's what they need, especially as their mind is growing.
I think that's very good advice. I'm also thinking about, just like being totally real here, I've seen such a difference just in the way the kids respond just since 2020 and the quarantine, because that packs some emotional bags, because they weren't allowed to go to school, they weren't allowed to be in stores, they weren't allowed to be around people like other than our immediate family. And I know that a lot of families are dealing with that right now because 2020 had a major shift in things. How do you think that might play into any of this, as far as bags that have been packed just because of the things we've gone through globally?
Yeah, I think it's tremendous. I mean, because like you mentioned, we were all told to stay away from people.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're told we can be around people again. And for kids who have not been around, a lot of people for a long period of time, they just don't know how to relationally enter back into those spaces. And so as parents, for sure, as anybody who kind of works with the next generation, it's almost like what we have to do is facilitate relationships. I mean, that's maybe another practical suggestion I would add, is figure out other families that you connect with and go be with them. Go to the pool, go to the beach if you live near the beach, go for a play date, whatever. Just get kids back into relational scenarios so that they have to be face to face with people and they have to have conversations. And I mean, I even see it with my teenagers, who are, I think, relatively healthy, relatively well functioning kids. But there are things that sort of relationally I would think are like normal, that they'll say, "Oh, Dad, that's weird." Like if I were to like text this person or ask this person that's just weird. And it's not. And so as adults, we have to lead them into the healthy relationships that they need in order to function in life. And so I would say that's one of the biggest sort of practical things kind of coming out of the pandemic, is they're just relationally challenged and we got to help them be in good, healthy relationships.
I would completely agree with that. I'm looking at my 5-year-old, who was obviously very small when we went into everything. So he's not had much experience other than just being at home and doing virtual schooling and things like that. But it's fascinating to see those differences. But I think what I'm hearing you say is that it always comes back to that conversation and opening the doors for that and having the relationship say, "Hey, I noticed this is going on. What do you think about that? What are your thoughts? What have you noticed with your friends? What have you noticed in the school setting?" Like, it just opening that dialogue, I think, is such a critical part of all of this. So I love that you're working on the talking points. That's going to be extremely helpful too. I know that I think a lot of what we see too, like specifically what stood out in my mind when you said that, as far as the performance and backing off on things like the room being clean. And I had to laugh because I could see such a difference. But I think so much of it is because that they are processing things differently.
Yeah.
Because it's like it's like the emotional baggage that I guess I'm not even sure what to call it, but just when they were lacking that stimulation of being outside of the house for so long, that creates those issues. But even having that conversation is like, I've noticed that this has changed. This is something
Yeah.
that's different.
And I think sometimes kids, like you may ask a kid a question, and this is true for teenagers as well. You may ask a kid a question about something,
Mm-hmm.
what do you recognize in your friends? What's going on in you? And they're likely going to say, I don't know.
Exactly.
And what I've had to learn, and I've had to lead with empathy with my kids in this, quite honestly, it's been a kind of a skill I've had to learn in the last couple of years. But what I've had to learn is they don't know, like they really don't. And another kind of just sort of phrase that I came up with a couple of years ago is oftentimes we want to push our kids through things. We want them to develop grit. We want them to kind of be stronger. All true. All that I want for my kids. What I think kids need more nowadays is they need us to help them through it. It's different. Pushing. There are times where I've got to push my kids through things, of course. But I think what they need is they need us to help them through it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like when one of my kids might say, "Well, I don't know the answer to that," instead of saying, "Well, yeah, you do. Come on, let's get it, spit it out." No, I need to just be patient, circle back to the conversation another day, be relationally kind of close to them, and just help them be able to deal with it because they're different kids who have gone through a different time than any of us ever have.
Exactly.
And we all need to just sort of back up a little bit. And the other thing I'll say too is the thing that's most important, I think, for me, and I hope it's true for most parents, is the relationship. Like I don't want to do anything to jeopardize the relationship with my kids. Had a wise mentor tell me years ago, like one of the real goals in parenting is to have a relationship with your kids when they're in their 20s. And so with things like, the room, or even like with us, just to be totally honest, with our son, it was his junior year when we were going through the pandemic, kind of the heat of it. And he had been a straight A student, and he had kind of, always been right on top of things for years and years. And the pandemic just sort of crushed him in some ways academically. And both my wife and I had to say, you know what, like we can push and we can push and we can push and lose the relationship and get him into a better college, or we can kind of help and love and encourage and build the relationship and let him sort of fail in some areas academically, and everything will still be fine. And it has been. I mean, he's headed off to college, probably not the one he wanted to go to, if I'm honest, the one he could have gone to had we pushed him harder. But our relationship is strong, and so for parents, you got to think with the end in mind, and what you really want is you want that relationship with your kids instead of to get them to that quote unquote American dream or whatever your dream for them is. Somebody else said to me years ago, you can't want it more than your kids do.
Absolutely.
And so we've had to learn that we got to help him through things, and our daughter, we got to help them through things. We can't want it more than they do. And we want to maintain the relationship.
Absolutely. That's very solid advice. And two comments here. The first one, as far as kids saying, I don't know, because they're probably going to say that first off. And one phrase that I like to say is, it's okay if you don't have an answer for that yet.
No, that's
but
great.
I want you to be thinking about it.
That's great.
Just so they
Love
can
it.
be thinking about it. They come back to it and maybe point things out too, to say,
Sure.
it's like, do you know that conversation we were having the other day? This might be something that is related to that. Just kind of point things in that direction that way. But the whole, it's okay if you don't have an answer yet. But the word yet is a powerful word. It has so many layers to it, just for 3 letters. But just to encourage them to be thinking and processing and just to be aware, because it goes back to that raising awareness.
I'm totally stealing that. Thanks for that today. That's
You're
awesome.
welcome. Enjoy. And then the second thing, when we're talking about focusing on that relationship, and I have just in prayer, just asking God, like, okay, what do I do with this? Because there are certain things that I was struggling with kids, and I felt like the answer that I keep getting is teach them to connect with me, teach them to have a relationship with me, because that's what's most important. That's the part that's going to matter the most. And we model that by having those good relationships with our kids, because our kids are going to understand our Heavenly Father through the lens of their earthly parents. And when we are modeling things well to them, it helps reinforce that. And we can even make sure they know, like, hey, God's perfect. I'm not. I'm confessing that like I admit that I have failed in this. I'm sorry if we mess up. We can go apologize about that, and we can make that clear. But at the same time, recognizing that if they have a good relationship with us, they're more likely to have a good relationship with the Heavenly Father.
Oh, I love that. And that makes me think through kind of one of the practical suggestions on the identity bag. So as kids are kind of asking, who am I? One of the things that we as parents and really adults have to do is we have to model our identity in Christ.
Right.
Right. So kind of the same thing you're saying is I want to model that I believe that I am a child of God first and foremost, and I'm going to model that to my kids so that they know that's sort of what something that they can do. They can recognize that they're a child of God, and so the modeling that you talk about, I think, is so critical in a lot of ways, because if as a parent I want my kids to kind of get better, and I want them to be religious-ish, and I want them to kind of be around church, but I myself don't really have a relationship with Christ that I can model to them. They see that. They see it from a mile away. They want authenticity. They want kind of, the real picture of who we are. So we got to model. We got to have a relationship with Christ. Got to model it to them in order for them to see it and to catch it. So I totally agree with the modeling.
That identity piece is such a
Yep.
important part of having any kind of freedom and joy and peace in life. And
Yep,
that's been
right.
such a focus of the podcast too, just knowing your identity in Christ and what that actually means for you. Because when
Yeah.
you really know how loved you are, when you really know how much God sees you and cares about you, when you really get it, things change. It puts
Yep.
everything in perspective. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you as well. All the things we're tempted to worry about, those things fall into place, like the job, the career, the school they go to, all those things will fall into place if they know who he is and who they are
That's
in
right.
him. If
That's
that
right.
piece is there, that's success that's my definition of
Yeah,
success as a parent. If they know that part, if they
I
know who and
agree.
whose they are,
I
the
agree.
rest falls in place.
And I would say, again, kind of referring back to our son. I mean, he's headed off to a great school. Don't get me wrong, but again, like I said, maybe not the one that he could have gotten into or wanted to, but he knows who he is in Jesus, and he's excited about the opportunity to be in ministry and to grow in kind of his next phase of life, and that's a win. That's
Absolutely.
bigger than any other win, because we could have gotten him to the quote unquote right school in our context, and he could have just been chasing the world, and that's not what we wanted.
That would be a lot of extra bags that he doesn't
You
need to
got it.
carry. I love this, and I'm going to be sharing this with several people here in my personal life that I want to be able to understand this better, that are maybe in ministry or wanting to work with teens or young adults. But I want to make sure you have a chance too to share where others can find your book and more about your ministry. And then I would like to ask you to pray for those who are listening. But
I
first,
would love to. Yeah.
where can people find you?
So you can find me. I mean, I work at Port City Community Church in Wilmington, North Carolina. So we do a lot of things for parents and people there. The book you can get at thebagsbook.com. Thebagsbook.com. You can also get it on Amazon. Again, just bags helping your kids lighten the load. It's been on Amazon since day one. And then there's another site, equipandencourage.com, which is basically where what I want to do is equip and encourage parents and leaders to help the next generation walk with God. And so there's some articles on there, and I would love to just help anybody who kind of needs help with this. Like I mentioned, I have done a lot of parent seminars, and it's always kind of eye-opening for parents, and hopefully an encouraging moment. So if you're at a church and you want someone to come to a parent seminar, I'd love to do that. Like I mentioned, also, I kind of met yesterday with a group of educators at a Christian school. We had this conversation. And so I would just love to kind of help any adult who's dealing with kids to be able to talk through this. And so you can find me at those two websites. And I'm just thankful to be a part of the conversation today.
I'm so glad that you've been here. And I just, like I said, I wanted to invite you to just have prayer for those who are listening, whether they're parents or whether they're in ministry dealing with parents and trying to encourage these teenagers, whoever it may be. Just I would ask that you say a word of prayer for them.
You got it. Would love to. Jesus, we thank you for this time together. Thank you for Carrie and her podcast, and for just all the conversations that she's able to have along the way with people to encourage them in their identity in you. And so, Jesus, I do just pray that if this has stirred anybody about their own baggage, or if they want to have conversations with teenagers or kids about the bags that they might be packing, that you just give them the words to say, that you give them the wisdom and the discernment to have the right conversations, Lord, in order to push these kids towards a relationship with you and just having a lighter load along the way. So thank you for this opportunity. Thanks for all you do. And we love you and pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much for that. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we wrap up? Anything that you want to make sure people know about your book or about maybe lightening the load?
I would say don't underestimate the power of these conversations. Don't do what most of us do in life, is just sort of sweep this baggage under the rug and think that it doesn't matter, because I think these conversations are more critical than we know. I think what's going on with our kids is deeper than we know. And I think we just need to make sure we're paying attention to it. So don't minimize what's going on with our kids. That's what I would say.
Well said. I completely 100% agree. Thank you so much for your time today. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and appreciate you sharing the work that you've put into this. And I appreciate that you've put the work into it to start with, because this is a very powerful message that needs to be heard.
Well, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you once again for tuning in to the Everyday Royalty Podcast. I'm honored to have you as a listener and do hope that you will go rate and review this episode so others can find it too. If you are a woman in ministry, I recently created a 30-day prayer calendar with daily prompts to pray for those in your ministry. If you'd like to download that for free and join my mailing list, go to prayercalendar.everydayincredible.net. Always remember who and whose you are, and have a blessed day.